I am observing the convergence of three incompatible strategic visions in Venezuela, a collision that reveals far more about the future trajectory of global power than any single crisis should. What appears on the surface as a regional dispute over governance, economic collapse, and humanitarian catastrophe is in reality the first comprehensive test of whether the United States can reassert hemispheric dominance in an era when China possesses both the economic resources and geopolitical ambition to challenge American prerogatives in what Washington has considered its exclusive sphere of influence for nearly 2 centuries. The Venezuela crisis has become a proxy battlefield where the Monroe Doctrine meets the Belt and Road Initiative, where American coercive diplomacy confronts Chinese economic statecraft, and where the fundamental question of 21st century order, whether the world will fragment into competing spheres or maintain some semblance of universal rules, will be partially answered. As I analyze the strategic calculations of Washington, Beijing, and Caracas, I see not merely a crisis to be managed, but a structural transformation that no diplomatic initiative, however skillfully crafted, can reverse. The Trump administration's approach to Venezuela represents an attempt to resurrect a vision of American hemispheric dominance that has been eroding for decades, but which Trump believes can be restored through a combination of economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the credible threat of military intervention. The impossible deal that Trump seeks involves the simultaneous achievement of multiple objectives: the removal of the Maduro government and its replacement with a pro-American leadership that restores Venezuela's petroleum sector to Western-aligned production, the expulsion or dramatic reduction of Chinese economic presence and influence, the restoration of American companies to privileged positions in Venezuelan energy markets, and the demonstration to the entire hemisphere that alignment with China or defiance of American preferences carries unbearable costs. This is not merely regime change. It is an attempt to roll back 2 decades of Chinese economic penetration into Latin America and reassert a hemispheric order in which American power remains uncontested. The fundamental problem with this vision, as I observe it unfolding, is that every element depends on conditions that no longer exist. American leverage in Latin America has declined dramatically since the Cold War. The region's economies are increasingly integrated with Chinese trade and investment. Alternative financing mechanisms have emerged that reduce dependence on American-dominated institutions. Regional organizations like CELAC have been explicitly constructed to exclude the United States and provide platforms for Latin American states to coordinate policies independently of Washington. Most critically, China has become the primary trading partner for most major South American economies, a position that gives Beijing influence that cannot be easily displaced through American sanctions or pressure campaigns. Venezuela itself has become so dependent on Chinese financing, technical support, and market access for its petroleum exports that any deal requiring the exclusion of Chinese interests is literally impossible to implement without Chinese acquiescence. I trace the evolution of Chinese engagement with Venezuela and find a coherent long-term strategy that contrasts sharply with the reactive, short-term character of American policy. China began establishing economic ties with Venezuela during the Chavez era, initially focused on securing energy supplies for China's rapidly growing economy. Over time, these relationships deepened into comprehensive economic partnerships involving loans for oil agreements, infrastructure development, technology transfers, and joint ventures across multiple sectors. The critical advantage China offered Venezuela was unconditional financing with no requirements for political reform, market liberalization, or alignment with Western governance standards. While the International Monetary Fund and World Bank demanded austerity and structural adjustment, China provided capital with minimal conditions. While the United States imposed sanctions and isolation, China offered integration into global supply chains and access to the world's largest market. The scale of Chinese financial commitment to Venezuela is staggering and often underappreciated in American policy analysis. China has extended over $60 billion in loans to Venezuela since 2007, making it one of China's largest debtor nations globally. These loans are predominantly secured against future oil deliveries, creating a structural relationship in which Venezuela's petroleum sector functions partly as collateral for Chinese financing. Additionally, Chinese state-owned enterprises have invested directly in Venezuelan oil fields, refineries, and related infrastructure, giving China not just financial exposure but operational involvement in the country's energy sector. This creates a situation where any political transition in Venezuela, regardless of how it occurs, must either accommodate Chinese interests or trigger a financial crisis that would make economic recovery impossible. From Beijing's perspective, Venezuela represents a strategic asset with multiple dimensions of value. First, it provides energy security through long-term supply agreements that reduce China's dependence on Middle Eastern petroleum and maritime choke points controlled by the U.S. Navy. Second, it demonstrates China's credibility as a reliable partner for states facing American pressure, a signal that resonates across the global South, where many governments fear U.S. intervention or coercion. Third, it establishes precedents for Chinese economic presence in the Western Hemisphere, challenging the Monroe Doctrine not through military confrontation, but through economic integration that makes American exclusionary policies unworkable. Fourth, it creates leverage over the United States by positioning China as a necessary participant in any resolution of regional crises, thereby elevating Chinese status from regional actor to indispensable global power. The Trump administration's deal seeks to overcome these realities through a combination of maximum pressure on Venezuela and some form of accommodation with China that would induce Beijing to sacrifice its Venezuelan interests in exchange for concessions in other domains, perhaps trade negotiations, reduced tariffs, or American restraint regarding Taiwan. I observe this strategy and recognize it as fundamentally flawed because it misunderstands Chinese strategic priorities. China's leadership views Venezuela not as an isolated investment to be bargained away, but as a test case for whether China can maintain economic partnerships despite American opposition. To abandon Venezuela under U.S. pressure would signal to every other developing country that Chinese partnership offers no protection against American coercion, fundamentally undermining China's entire Belt and Road strategy. Therefore, Beijing's strategic calculus is clear. It must support Venezuela to preserve credibility globally, even if this means accepting short-term costs in U.S.-China relations. The Venezuelan government's position in this three-way dynamic is weaker than it appears, but more resilient than American policymakers typically acknowledge. The Maduro government faces comprehensive American sanctions, diplomatic isolation from most Western and many Latin American governments, severe economic contraction, hyperinflation, and massive emigration that has created humanitarian crises across the region. Yet it survives, not through popular legitimacy or effective governance, but through a combination of repressive capacity, control over remaining economic resources, and critical external support primarily from China, but also from Russia, Cuba, and Iran. This coalition of states supporting Maduro does not do so out of ideological affinity or personal loyalty, but because each has strategic interests in demonstrating that American regime change efforts can be resisted. From Caracas's perspective, the optimal outcome involves securing Chinese financial support sufficient to stabilize the economy, while using that stability to gradually reduce dependence on any single external patron. This requires maintaining Chinese interests through continued petroleum deliveries and investment opportunities, while simultaneously exploring potential openings with the United States that might allow some sanctions relief without requiring political capitulation. The Maduro government is not ideologically committed to permanent Chinese alignment. It is committed to regime survival, and it will partner with whoever best serves that interest. The problem for Washington is that current American policy offers Venezuela nothing but regime change, which obviously cannot be accepted by the current government, while China offers continued support without demanding political transformation. I analyze Trump's negotiating position and find it undermined by structural weaknesses that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. The United States can impose severe economic costs on Venezuela through sanctions, but it cannot prevent China from providing the financing necessary to keep the government functioning. The United States can threaten military intervention, but the costs of actual military action, financial, diplomatic, and domestic political, make the threat largely incredible, and both China and Venezuela recognize this. The United States can offer Venezuela normalization and sanctions relief, but only in exchange for regime change, which makes the offer valueless to the current government. The United States can attempt to pressure China through tariffs or other economic measures, but China's own economy is large enough and diversified enough that targeted pressure over Venezuela specifically is unlikely to alter Beijing's strategic calculus. The fundamental impossibility of Trump's deal lies in its requirement that all three parties accept outcomes contrary to their vital interests. For the deal to work as conceived, Venezuela would need to accept regime change, China would need to accept the loss of a major strategic investment and precedent-setting partnership, and the United States would need to accept some continuing Chinese presence in the hemisphere. None of these outcomes is acceptable to the respective parties. Venezuela will not voluntarily remove itself from power. China will not voluntarily demonstrate that its partnerships collapse under American pressure, and the Trump administration will not voluntarily accept Chinese economic influence in what it considers America's hemisphere. This triple incompatibility means that the current configuration is stable, not because it represents an equilibrium, but because it represents a stalemate where no party can force the outcomes it seeks. The deeper significance of the Venezuela crisis extends far beyond the fate of one country or even one region. It represents the collision of two fundamentally different visions of international order. The American vision, rooted in the Monroe Doctrine and updated for the 21st century, holds that great powers should exercise primary influence within their respective geographic spheres, that the Western Hemisphere should remain predominantly under American leadership, and that extra-hemispheric powers should respect these spheres of influence as a foundation for great power stability. The Chinese vision, articulated through Belt and Road and China's broader global engagement strategy, holds that economic partnerships should not be constrained by geographic spheres, that all countries should be free to pursue relationships based on mutual benefit regardless of great power preferences, and that the era of exclusive spheres of influence is over. These visions are irreconcilable. If China's vision prevails, American influence in Latin America will continue to erode as economic integration with China deepens, trade patterns shift, and countries across the region calculate that they can pursue relationships with Beijing without triggering unbearable American retaliation. If the American vision prevails, China's Belt and Road Initiative will be revealed as vulnerable to great power opposition, Chinese partnerships will be shown to collapse under pressure, and countries globally will recalculate the risks of aligning with China against American preferences. Venezuela has become the test case precisely because it represents the clearest confrontation between these competing visions, a Latin American country that has explicitly chosen Chinese partnership in defiance of American pressure. I examine the likely trajectories and find no scenario that resolves the underlying tension. The first possibility is stalemate prolongation, where the current configuration continues indefinitely with Venezuela economically crippled but politically stable, Chinese investment locked in but not expanding dramatically, and American influence diminished but not eliminated. This is perhaps the most likely outcome in the near term, but is unsustainable long term, as Venezuelan economic and humanitarian conditions deteriorate further, triggering regional crises that demand resolution. The second possibility is American capitulation disguised as negotiation, where the United States gradually accepts some continuing role for China in Venezuela in exchange for nominal political reforms that preserve current power structures with cosmetic changes. This would represent a strategic defeat for American hemispheric ambitions, but might be politically acceptable if framed as pragmatic compromise. The third possibility is Chinese strategic retreat, where Beijing decides that the costs of supporting Venezuela, financial losses, reputational damage from association with an increasingly failed state, and tensions with the United States exceed the benefits of maintaining the partnership. This seems least likely given China's broader strategic imperatives, but could occur if internal Chinese economic pressures force retrenchment of foreign commitments. The fourth possibility, and perhaps most dangerous, is escalation toward confrontation, where the United States attempts to force Chinese withdrawal through measures that risk broader conflict, comprehensive sanctions on Chinese entities involved in Venezuela, naval interdiction of petroleum shipments, or even limited military action designed to demonstrate American resolve. Such escalation would not be undertaken lightly, but it becomes more probable if Trump perceives that his entire hemispheric strategy depends on demonstrating that China can be expelled from American-dominated regions. China, facing this level of pressure, would need to decide whether to retreat and accept the precedent or to double down on support for Venezuela as a test of resolve, potentially leading to the first direct great power confrontation over influence in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What disturbs me most as I analyze this situation is the absence of genuine diplomatic engagement aimed at finding outcomes that all parties can accept. Instead, I observe three powers pursuing maximalist objectives while hoping that pressure will force the other parties to capitulate. The United States seeks complete Chinese withdrawal and regime change. China seeks to maintain its partnership regardless of American objections. Venezuela seeks regime survival with economic stabilization. These objectives cannot all be achieved simultaneously, yet none of the parties is seriously exploring compromise frameworks that would require each to accept less than its preferred outcome. This diplomatic vacuum increases the probability that the crisis will be resolved through some form of coercion or collapse rather than negotiation, with consequences that extend far beyond Venezuela. The regional implications are profound and underanalyzed in American policy discourse. Every Latin American government is watching this crisis and drawing conclusions about the risks and benefits of Chinese partnership. If Venezuela weathers American pressure with Chinese support and eventually stabilizes, countries across the region will conclude that Chinese partnerships are sustainable, even in the face of American opposition. If Venezuela collapses and Chinese investment is lost, countries will recalculate the risks of deep Chinese engagement. The outcome in Venezuela will therefore shape economic and strategic decisions across the entire hemisphere for decades to come. American policymakers seem to understand this intellectually, but have not translated that understanding into policies that could actually achieve American objectives given the constraints of Chinese involvement. I reflect on what an actually achievable policy would require and find that it would demand American acceptance of outcomes that no recent American administration would consider acceptable. A realistic settlement would involve the United States acknowledging that China will maintain significant economic presence in Venezuela, Venezuela agreeing to political reforms and governance improvements that fall short of regime change but provide some accountability and representation, and China accepting limitations on the expansion of its presence and commitments to transparency regarding the terms of its loans and investments. This would be a classic great power compromise where each party gets some of what it wants, but none gets everything. The problem is that such a compromise requires all three parties to move simultaneously toward moderation, and the current incentive structures all push toward maximalism rather than compromise. Trump's personal negotiating style, which has occasionally produced surprising breakthroughs through willingness to abandon conventional positions, might theoretically be suited to this kind of complex bargain. However, I observe that Trump's approach to Venezuela has been consistently hardline, shaped by domestic political considerations involving Florida's Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities who support